Good afternoon and welcome. I know it's a bit sweltering and we had a really long afternoon. So just before anything, a great thank you to the organizers of the conference, Zurich University of the Arts, and of course to their provocators and our colleagues over here. A special thank you also goes out to Connecting Space Hong Kong with Patrick and Nuria, who have provided very strong support behind this, this project itself. So without further ado, I'm just gonna talk briefly about our project because it's sort of, it is a more concentrated research project that we undertook about a year ago. And in between our last conference, the one that we had in Mumbai, and until today, there were many different decisions, there were a lot of research that were done and abandoned at the same time. So I will be giving sort of a roundup as to how we got to where we are. And Samson's going to be talking later about the artwork and the presentation itself, and Giorgio's going to be rounding up for us. So before I get any further, some of you might be familiar with the earlier title that we came up for the project called the Gaifeng Orchestra. Now, the idea of the Gaifeng is a very etymologically centered Cantonese term that's used to refer to a group of people who live in a single neighborhood, and also used to describe mutual aid associations that we have that were founded in 1949 under the British administration. One of the interests that we wanted to look into were these self-organized orchestras, because most of them did not form with the idea of being institutions of their own, but really just people who got together, who were taught in music to come to be. And it was sort of a more organic thing. And in Hong Kong, you would find a lot of these associations that were linked to various professions, like the Hong Kong doctors and nurses orchestra, and so on and so forth. But we were also, at the point of time in Mumbai, we were also questioning what does it mean for the term Gaifeng, or how do you even look at the notion of the Gaifeng, which is a very local term, in terms of Hong Kong, which essentially is a place of migrants, transitory space, as opposed to a place itself, just to quote Akbar Abbas on this. And we looked into various case studies that were happening in Hong Kong itself, one of them being the Blue House in Wan Chai, whom we had a conversation with Him Lo, the curator of the House of Stories. This is the Blue House in the heart of Wan Chai itself. It is a 1920s building. No elevators, common toilets, made out of old neighborhood. And there is a story about how it was the site of the first common hospital in Hong Kong, and till today it still stands among the history of Hong Kong as a very key place and a key bastion against the rapid redevelopment of the urban landscape in Wan Chai itself. You would note that around this district, there are a lot of bars, and it's fast gentrifying. And so far, the Blue House still stands as one of the few heritage projects that is continuously under discussion. And on the ground floor, there is this small little community center called the House of Stories, where they try to preserve the history and the heritage. And of course, seeing that as a case study, it came to us as a question. It's how would you define your community? How would you even talk about it? Because that was something that we wanted to ask, how do you use the word Gaifeng? We also acknowledge in the fact that in Hong Kong itself, strangely enough, there were many gaps. If we were to talk about multiple communities, marginal communities who fall within the cracks itself, the peripheries, there would be one of the bigger places called the Chungking Mansion. Of course, there were people who experienced the Chungking Mansions through the lens of Rongkawai with the film itself, this very romantic, essentialized ontology happening. And of course, there's the other, which is Professor Gordon Matthews, who has written about the Chungking Mansions as a ghetto of the world. Now, the thing is that the Chungking Mansions exist as an attraction for tourists, primarily through the movie itself, but also like locals would have very little to do with the area itself. It is 17 floors, and it consists of 5,000 inhabitants so far. Inside this center itself, inside this building is like one of the last bastion of like what we call walled city in Hong Kong. But also on the other hand was the heart of used mobile phone trades in the 90s and the 2000s. It also meant that within the 5 towers of this building also there were like many different fragmented communities, ethnicities, such as like the African, coming from the African continent, or even like merchants from India who are trying to deal with, say, trade in terms of DVDs, in terms of prostitution, in terms of guest houses, and so on and so forth. There are also like questions as to like how do you reach out to them, because they were a closed community of their own. Like the politics within the building itself is astounding. Like some of them ending up with questions as to like the politics as to who can claim refugee status within Hong Kong itself and who cannot. So that was another question that we kind of look into. Like, if we were to talk about the guy from other community, and we look at such periphery communities, is there a question, do we even fetishize like such communities in this public encounter, or how can we deal with it in a sensitive or sincere manner? We also look back in the history of North Point. Now, this is a district where the connecting spaces, and also quite familiar to Samson, Giorgio, and I. And you can see that this is just 20 minutes away from the central of Hong Kong itself, and also like historically known to be like sort of known to be a non-Cantonese speaking community from the south of China called the Hokkien people, or the Fujian people from the Fujian province. There were also other elements of like past grandeur, such as like cinemas that now have been disregarded, or even the closest that we have to a rate cinema, which is the Sunbeam Theatre, that is dedicated purely to Cantonese opera and directly 2 streets away from connecting space. And also the heart of like, you know, the closest leftist riots in Hong Kong in 1967, where like people were given the choice. There was this huge riot between people siding with what was then the People's Republic of China and those for the British administration. This one event itself resulted in 51 people dying, and still is like recognized as one of the key points in Hong Kong history, where they had to decide which form of governance there is. So, I mean, back to connecting space itself, we were playing around with like all these questions as to like what do we do, what are the issues that we can solve, or what can we even do in a sincere manner, given that we were having this 1-year research. There are bound to be doubts, there's bound to be contradictions. Our initial idea was to create a community orchestra made out of people from the streets, because like it was this informality that intervenes within the formality of playing a piece of music together. But particularly like looking at connecting space, and the gallery itself, as you can see, which opens to a street level. We also tried to think about like, does it make sense to have a public encounter, or what would a public encounter mean in such a temporary sense as an event? So we actually came up with this proposal, which was a presentation by Samson based on the film itself. and also making it into a more of an exhibition with different public events leading up to it, and it was called Orchestrations. So we were also like drawing from Samson's training as a composer, the idea of what it means to make an orchestra or to orchestrate in all sense of the word, like the wider idea of orchestrating through political means, through communities and so on. These are exhibition shots that happen in the space. We created a space that would be somewhat bibliographical. You can see over here, like this is a music stand that we kind of created to kind of put up different materials that we collected through the year itself to kind of make the research more porous. And also like a viewing room for the film, which you will see later at 6:30. Together, 6 o'clock, together with like a book that was published in conjunction with the film itself to kind of bring both together as a workbook as to like how people can create communities through orchestra making. These are also abstract drawings that were done previously by Samson based on weaponry, like how they can be read in a different manner. And the book itself. So we also had different public programs that ran through the weekend itself. One of them dealing with a workshop that took a page out of the book itself. Like there was an activity that was proposed there as to how to form a loose community, which was to learn to make a bird song, a bird whistle. And also a screening of a film as to like how orchestras or even the act of making music can bring people together, even for that shared interest as opposed to the heaviness of a commitment. The commitment is still there, but it's communicated through a different dedication. I'm just gonna leave this here and pass to Samson.
Great, thank you, Qinyi. So what I'm going to do then is take you through. Yeah, I should swap chairs with you. Walk you through the individual pieces in that were shown in the exhibition, so of course. So just to clarify, the exhibition had a couple of different components. There was a film and a publication, and the two of them together were titled Orchestration. So the publication is like a big format book, and the film is the film that you're going to see tonight. And then there were a whole bunch of works that. Older works that sort of contextualized the film, and I have to say I think this the exhibition for me was not closed, like it was not complete in a sense. I don't think I have worked out and worked through all of the things that I set out to think about yet, and it's a constant work in progress. So I think like the exhibition is more like a snapshot of a sort of a moving, a more fluid thinking process. So just to tell you about the first thing, the central piece in the exhibition, which is the film. It's called Orchestration, and the film so Qinyi talked about how we first started to think about sort of orchestra as a way to bring people together, and we were like, oh, maybe we can make a community orchestra and look into sort of the function of community orchestras, and maybe we could even proactively lead and guide some of these activities and channel that energy to some ends. But then I think we pretty quickly abandoned that idea. Yeah, because I mean there are many reasons, but I thought, for example, that these community orchestra. What I have later found out was that these community orchestra, of course, they already exist and they do excellent work, and so it's not really a matter of sort of individual communities needing me or us as artists to sort of intervene, but sort of we kind of need them more. I mean, you know, they are actually doing very interesting work, and so so the project sort of from that thinking, the project sort of shifted gear and also shifted direction. So what ended up happening is that I looked more sort of inward and started to look at and think about personal experiences that I have had in participating in these community orchestras and amateur music groups, and what these amateur music groups have offered me, and sort of how I have been educated or enlightened or sort of reinvigorated by participating in these groups. And so I identified three such orchestras to film and to follow and to work with. The first orchestra is actually a community Chinese orchestra. And this community Chinese orchestra is run out of a high school, and it's called a Yayue Chinese orchestra. And it has all the features that you expect from a community Chinese orchestra. How they use the space, how the membership is sort of formed, how they are funded entirely by the membership itself. But what is really remarkable about this orchestra also is the fact that in the work of this orchestra, you see the devotion of two remarkable individuals who basically devoted their life to building in this orchestra and sort of investing their personal time and resources into sustaining this orchestra. So they became sort of subject of my interview, and I filmed the rehearsal process, starting to sort of, I guess I was trying to understand why they invested so much time into this group and why it was important to them. Aside from what I sort of the obvious reasons that I could think of. I mean, in a way, these are not so obvious reasons. I really needed to ask them and to find out these. So I started with some very naive questions. So sort of like, you know, why was it important to you? What is an orchestra to you? At the background, there's always this question of what is an orchestra to them. So one thing that I didn't mention is that all the three groups that I followed, they are all, of course, called orchestras, but this project ended up being about how the word orchestra or orchestration has been, I guess, appropriated in different contexts. So the Chinese orchestra, of course, we call them an orchestra because they sort of, they're all these Chinese instruments, but they model themselves after the Western orchestra. But there's no reason why they must call themselves an orchestra, apart from sort of historical incidental reason. And then a second group that I interviewed and followed, it's a gamelan ensemble at the Hong Kong University, which Giorgio, of course, would be very familiar with. And I myself have very fond memories of playing in a gamelan ensemble when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Sydney, and then later on, when I came back to Hong Kong, I also played in gamelan. And the gamelan is often this ensemble, like if you're a music major or if you're like studying music in the BA program and you are not a good instrumentalist, the gamelan is where you end up at. Because you don't really need to read notation. You are sort of, it's a very oral tradition. You follow like the instructor, and you follow along, and it's very like, but all, you know, you're making music together in a group. It's incredibly, I found it incredibly empowering. But the gamelan ensemble, there's absolutely no reason why it must be called an orchestra, but it's often referred to, especially in older musicology textbook, as a gamelan orchestra. So I found that to be very interesting, and people often still refer to the group as an orchestra. So I guess I mean, I'm interested in including the ensemble in there. And then I also started asking these musicians sort of what they think about themselves being labeled as an orchestra. What do they think are some of the features of an orchestra that they also exhibit in the way that they rehearse and things like that. Again, very simple, naive question that otherwise, if not through this project, I guess I would not ask because I would automatically assume that I know. And so the Gamelan ensemble is the second ensemble that I work with, filmed their rehearsal. The third ensemble that I focused on really is the work of this one remarkable individual called Niels. She's an Australian who came here, an oboist to begin with, and she came to Hong Kong at first to perform with the Hong Kong Sinfonietta, which is a professional orchestra. But the Hong Kong Sinfonietta is a very special orchestra in the sense that they are the first orchestra in Hong Kong that is very proud of the fact that they mostly hire local graduates. So the other orchestra that is also professional and government funded in Hong Kong is the Hong Kong Philharmonic Orchestra, and they are often criticized for not being very inclusive of local musicians and composers. And actually, as I was working on this piece, there was a little bit of a scandal with the Hong Kong Phil not having any Hong Kong composer commissioned for the entire sort of concert season, and that sparked a whole sort of letter writing campaign, etc. And they actually, to their credit, they came around. So in the next 2 seasons, and in the current season, they made a real effort to include conductors and composers and musicians from the city. But Niels was performing at the Hong Kong Sinfonietta, and because Hong Kong Sinfonietta is mostly this group that is made up of local Hong Kong musicians, so all of the rehearsals are conducted in Cantonese. And so she learned Cantonese so that she essentially would know what's going on. And then later on, she wasn't happy about the way the orchestra, the artistic direction of the orchestra and where it's headed. So Leanne left the orchestra and founded single-handedly her own orchestra called the City Chamber Orchestra of Hong Kong, with absolutely no government funding to begin with and no patron. And now the City Chamber Orchestra is a very respectable orchestra in Hong Kong, but it still operates in this half-professional model where a lot of the musicians still supplement their income mostly with teaching jobs and other outside gigs, so it's not really a professional operation. And it's still a very sort of, definitely has a mom and pop shop feel to it. It's mostly still Leanne running the gig. So she's this remarkable individual, and I thought it was okay. So I need to sort of be quick. And then there's also this bit in the film. There's like a documentation of a reenactment of one of the sort of instruction pieces that was included in the publication. So the publication is essentially a guide and a manual that gives people an idea of how you might come together and make an ensemble that is called an orchestra but not really an institution. And included, so the publication begins with sort of how could we redefine what is an orchestra? How can we revive orchestra as not as a source of metaphor, but a target of metaphor, etc. So go through these sort of kind of heady intellectual sort of blah. And then in the second half, I wrote a whole bunch of instruction pieces that people could just come together and play. And with the aim of sort of people could use these pieces to create temporary communities. And then I also look back into the history of Fluxus instruction score, and I particularly selected a whole bunch of pieces that refer to the orchestra. So for example, like Rainbow for orchestra, or like concerto for, whatever, like the word concerto orchestra, when it's used in these instruction pieces, I find it often quite ambiguous what they actually really mean by by an orchestra? I mean, are you using the word orchestra because it gives you an aura of legitimacy or because it sounds grand? I mean, what are you really referring to? So I included all these pieces, which actually, so the publication is really a combined effort between me and Giorgio, because I wrote a draft, I gave it to Giorgio, and then he sort of inserted text. It was a little bit like yeah, it was a collaboration. So I think I'm going to play a little bit of the film. Because you're going to see it tonight, I'm not going to play a lot of it. Just a bit at the beginning of the dialogue.
你會覺得係一大班人，但係出嚟嘅效果係得一個咁樣。
Orchestra is more of like different instruments coming together, producing like one whole sound, and like the beauty out of like orchestra would be like all those different sounds that they produce. So they each have like their own color and all those stuff. But then like it was brought together by being like in a group. How you get close to each other as well, because like you spend time a lot with them, and the fact that we see the growth with each member as well, because like at the start it was very messy, and then like once we near like the time when we are actually going to perform, it actually started forming together, and there's like a joy behind that as well.
Yes, because you're going to see it tonight, I'm not going to play too much of it. But I just want to say that I just want to say, talk a little bit about how I edited. I don't usually make films. I mean, I make video, but I'm a composer to begin. Like, I work with sound and music mostly. So the way I edited the film, I was mostly editing, like I was editing a composition. So I was. And you would hear, like tonight, that my treatment of the sound is pretty heavy-handed. I mean, so I was basically like, cutting the rehearsal so it would become a composition that would make musical sense. And so I'm gonna just quickly fly through the other pieces that were shown. Some of these are more usually what I do. So these are, we also showed a whole bunch of these drawings, which are graphical notation of explosion sound, which came from the last research project that I did, where I looked at the history of musician and sound engineers' involvement in warfare, and also the role of music and sound in war. So it's a part of like a larger project, but I guess Qinyi and I thought that these would give, it would show the trajectory of the research. And these actually, so this belongs to the same group of work. These are actually military strategies, military tactics, but described in musical notation. And you are meant to read them in conjunction to a map where, in that project, I imagined a defense, like a whole defense scheme of maneuvers that could be implemented in the case of an invasion of Hong Kong, with notation. And this is a new piece that was made for the exhibition. This actually, I do a lot of these works where I sort of vandalize musical scores, but this one is a special one. It actually came from the conductor of the Chinese orchestra that I was interviewing. He gave me a whole bunch of his conductor score with his markings, and then I like sort of painted and drew over it and added my comments and sort of, but I left his own the highlights are his rehearsal highlights, and I left them in there, and then I added my comments and then sort of printed stuff over them. And that actually came from an older piece, and I mean it's an ongoing series of pieces where I vandalize my own musical notation. And when I do that, I don't make copies of the original. So essentially what happened is once they've been vandalized and they've been covered up, then the piece can no longer be performed. So I won't have them played anymore. I mean, I have recordings of these pieces, but they won't ever be played anymore. I mean, I guess they sort of kind of take on a new life. Okay, Giorgio.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, maybe I'll take you from what you just said. It's not easy. One of the difficulties to be on a more sober, sort of play a more sober note here. One of the difficulties we had in some of the public programs, such as the guided tours or lectures, organized around the exhibition, had to do with music, in fact, and the perceived esoteric nature of music and musical notation. There is a paradox here. Music attracts enormously. The opening was a great success, for instance. And of course, scores can be beautiful objects in and of themselves, visual objects. But music is also perceived as being the domain of a few, people with a very specialized knowledge. And this creates a difficulty, for instance, when gallery dwellers come and ask us, well, I can't read music, so I can't, the object is opaque to me. And it was very difficult actually to tell them, well, all you need to do is to recognize it as a score. You're not being asked to read actually the notation. But somehow the passage proved to be difficult, even with people who we thought would know better. Generally, this is just one example of the many difficulties that Samson, I think, and challenges as well as opportunities that taking one's practice into a different domain as a composer entails. And music is perhaps too established, a practice for artists to fool around with. Sometimes we wonder. There are so many entrenched interests in the musical world, both practical and academic, that in fact we have been pushed away in some ways from it. Samson is becoming an artist, if I may call you so, right? And is no longer a composer. And I work also at the margins of the discipline, if you wish. Mostly work on visual culture, cinema, sound, theater, and so forth, as a musicologist, right? And of course, this passage can be negotiated successfully, but it also is a very, very difficult passage for us to engage with. So this is one predicament, and I mention this because I think of the guiding themes of draft is interdisciplinarity, and I think bringing music into the gallery or to a different audience, I think is one example of that, and one from which we're learning a lot. I also wanted to say that Samson was perhaps a bit too modest about the book, or maybe he didn't want to elaborate too much on it. But the book is, in fact, apart from being everything that he said it is also wonderfully evocative. If we could have an image of the book, that would be great. It's a wonderfully evocative object. Again, one does not have to necessarily be able to read any of the notation in it, not even the verbal notation, in fact, to appreciate it as an allusion to the music books of the past. Very large books, on a stand from which people would sing. And this is a practice that goes back to Gregorian chant, to the Middle Ages, in fact. It was very interesting that people gathered around this giant book. It's a very, very large book, like a choir book from the Renaissance, such as you see in collections across Europe. And people would gather around the book as the curator or the artist would open it, in something like the way singers used to gather around these books to sing polyphony from. Okay, and so I found the reenactment of this historical practice very touching, very moving, and that's the power of the object in creating a link with a very distant past. And this also called to mind the idea of the gallery audience as a kind of community. That, as it were, after the exhibition is over, is scattered, but somehow is marked. Brings with them a memory of a shared event. The film, I think, is very interesting in the way it stresses the anonymity of orchestra members, almost to the point of parody. And I think you've seen here the use of fragments, right? Most voices are off screen because the face doesn't make it into the frame, as it were. And very often, particularly in the section on the Chinese orchestra, you will not hear the orchestra as such. You'll hear fragments, and that's what the editing I thought was extremely noticeable and successful, in my opinion. Anyway, so it's your expectation. That an orchestral sound will finally, emerge is frustrated time and again. Generally speaking, the decision to move away from the community, creating a community orchestra, to contemplating, trying to understand already existing orchestras, has to do with our interest in looking at the conditions of orchestra making as a literal, not just a metaphorical, but a literal embodiment of community formations. So that was the general trend. And the choice of the space was also crucial in this respect. If I can have a frame of connecting space, just to give a sense of the broader context in which this project unfolded. And to return again to the metaphor of editing in cinema, a cut in cinema severs but also connects, right? There's a dual nature to cutting in films, and in some ways we often, going back to the space as we were preparing the exhibition, we felt that connecting space is more than even a cut in the context of the North Point street, but it's more like a rupture. This is not central, it's not Causeway, it's not Simsa Choi. The rents, though, are still extremely high, and the use of such a relatively large space for as a gallery is an extraordinary luxury in the Hong Kong context. So this is a rupture, a gallery space, a white cube in this context, right? Some people, in fact, walked in by mistake because the space is inviting somehow, right? And they didn't know it was a gallery, so they would walk in and then walk out again. But once you're in and you understand that a gallery, you understand it as a microcosm, you experience it as a microcosm that bears very little relation to what's around it. It's a wonderful space, of course, but it's also a space in which one feels besieged, because you're surrounded by a city that's about something else entirely, right? So making money, finance, and so forth. And so that's very important for you to understand the particular nature of the space that was created in the gallery. In conclusion, two things about music. The experience of music is metaphorical through and through. Metaphors are not something that we use to make sense of our musical experiences. Musical listening, and as well as music making, is metaphorical to begin with. So it's, metaphor subtends actually the experience of music. Music is a kind of metaphor incarnate in some ways. There is, however, a literal sense in which Samson's work here is exploring music as community formation, and that has to do precisely with performance. Because performance is the literal coming together of bodies. That somehow arrange themselves or organize in some form themselves toward a shared, not necessarily a common, but a shared goal. And of course, there is, orchestras can rehearse, but there are also spontaneous orchestras. And this is, I think, captured very well in the section of the film where subjects, volunteers use a bird whistle to mark a space in which an ensemble comes into being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a nice presentation. But I think I will just give my short comment from the political perspective because I don't have so much insight on the artistic side. So I think what is really interesting about the presentation is how I saw the first pictures where the policemen, you said that the policemen kill about 5,000 people. So from this, I try to really, it sounds highly interesting how the active power and supremacy continue to really reproduce themselves, and how this system also really try to ignite people to really have a kind of self-organized spirit, to really be under a kind of a situation whereby they can also try to be reproductive and develop a kind of a civil movement. Because this is what I really saw in the picture, and I think that for me it's highly very important to always see the political aspect of the picture, of how the image really interpret the political transformation, and how the system try to oppress people, but also give a chance for people also to revolt, and also allow the possibility for the people to be more recreative and create a self-organized movement. So this is just my few comments.
Thank you very much. Would you like to pick up on any of those, or we can hold those thoughts and?
Well, I mean, if we refer to the incident, the riot of 1967, where only 50 people were actually killed rather than 5,000. But one of the paradoxes of Hong Kong, and I guess emblematic maybe for the tragedy of the left everywhere, is that actually that was one of the most notable moments of uprising in the history of Hong Kong before the last 10 years. But the survivors of that movement are actually now, many of them, part of the establishment and part of the current rule of China in Hong Kong. So that's important to know, that it's one of these histories that took an perhaps unexpected turn.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bimbolo, as well. Sophie, yeah, great.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. My question is much more related to the notion of space in your project, and then it feels like it's a multi-layered goal to use space, to create space, maybe also using space as kind of epistemological category. I mean, we spoke a lot about notion of time, but I feel there's also a notion of space in it, on the one hand on an artistic level, but also curatorial level. So I'm trying to bring them together. An understanding you decided to use, on the one hand, the medium of an exhibition as a public format. Also, you decided to bring in sound through visuality, mostly. So, how would you translate this back into the public sphere of Hong Kong? I mean, you tried at the end a little bit that this is kind of an area where people not used to have a white cube. So, but still to this also idea of community, I wonder how that relates to each other.
Thank you.
I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding. Well, it's also partially right that it's in a very local, very middle-class area called North Point. But at the same time, it is one of the rare galleries or art spaces in Hong Kong that actually has a street front and faces out. So in which that we created like multiple temporalities through the public events to kind of bring in people and also like to guide them through like the different strategies that were being used. I mean, like there was a bit of a discomfort related to that because there was this feeling of subjectifying or imposing such strategies on the general public, whether or not they were willing or cognizant as to like what we were doing. And also at the same time, we tried to make the entire space as open as possible, not just through the encounter of the sound in the film, but also through, I spoke about the music stand with all references as well. And particularly like some of the books there were like heavily academic books when it comes to like talking about the definitions of sonic warfare, but one or two of them actually referred to Cornelis Cardew, like particularly a show that was done at the showroom, I think 5 years ago. So it's like we were also trying to bring in the notion of like the scratch orchestra, the failure, or like the abstraction or the tradition of the politics of notation that started and how it has evolved so far, like to bring in some references that would be much more friendly to the audience itself. I'm not too sure whether I'm answering the question.
But yeah, the clash I was talking about was made possible precisely by the fact that the space is in fact somewhat welcoming, and that you find yourself walking into it. Whereas other galleries are enshrined, and therefore, a different expectation emerges, and a complete different experience arises. So it's a fascinating location, actually, connected space in that respect. Space, yes, sound and space, in fact, are intertwined, and of course, one fundamental consequence of organized sound is the marking of a space, actually, in fact. And the space can be moving or not, but so you're right, maybe a gallery space, a given space, may prove problematic in such a project, and the gallery. But there are ways of manipulating the gallery space, right? So I'm playing with the imagination of the audience. So, but yes, I think you're quite right on that.
Great, thank you. Alice, of course, yeah, great.
Yeah, thanks for this really interesting presentation. I think my question is going to you, Samson, because I'm very interested in you choosing the medium of film. And I remember you saying that for you it's more a composition. So I think my question may be a few, like how did you come to choose these orchestras? Like what was the process and what's your relation to these orchestras? And also, what is the film as a, let me call it product or something that remains? What is your purpose, or like where will you be showing it? Who's addressed? What's this film, or what? Yeah, I think because I mean that's maybe just like a comment to. That's why I'm very curious to see the film. That's why it's kind of hard to talk about it. But I saw some snippets, and yeah, if it's like a documentary approach, or if it's in a way a musical piece in itself, like this kind of, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. That would be interesting.
Thank
Right.
you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of questions in that. First, why I chose to work with the film format. I mean, really, there isn't, I don't really have a very, I don't have a grand sounding answer. I mean, aside from the fact that I think the film, for me, the process of working behind the camera gave me an opportunity to just sit there and observe. Because most of the time what I'm doing is just sitting in their rehearsal and just trying to be like in the background and like not there. So they do their usual thing and they're not sort of like trying to you know, do something special. And yeah, filming allows me to, it gives me a reason to be there when they're rehearsing. It kind of was like that. I mean, it was a way of working with them. And I could also get them to sort of, when I interviewed them, it became, it kind of, well, to answer, I guess this is associated with your second question, which is how I chose the orchestra. All of these orchestras, like I said, they have two things. There are two features. One is that they are called or named orchestras, but there is a feature in the ensemble that makes me wonder whether the people who are making these orchestra are fully aware of what they are making and why and how they are appropriating the terminology of an orchestra. And this actually I do myself. In a previous project I made an iPhone orchestra and a laptop orchestra. And I look back to those projects and I wonder why I needed to call them laptop orchestras. I mean, like again, am I bestowing upon the ensemble an air of legitimacy by calling it an orchestra? Do more people come, or is it easier to explain to people what the group does? So then, so these groups, like I said, they like a Chinese orchestra, the City Chamber Orchestra of Hong Kong. Also, you know, what does Leanne think about, you know, a chamber orchestra? I mean, you have to think about sort of how. An orchestra, say, if of a standard size, is much more codified, and when the orchestra gets smaller and smaller, it's less and less codified, and it's more and more up to the individual who's making the orchestra to sort of make the decision about, oh, do you want a string orchestra plus sort of single winds, or do you want like 10 string players and make that an orchestra? You know, there's a lot more flexibility at that level. So that was the choice with the City Chamber Orchestra. And the gamelan, like I said, there was that misuse of the word orchestration. But aside from that, there's also a personal connection to each one of these ensembles. So Leung Ji-cheng and his wife, the Chinese orchestra couple, I just really admire them and sort of what they do, and their work is quite known to the community. And they collaborated with us in a Chinese orchestra plus laptop orchestra project earlier, and I've always thought that was like crazy of them. So and you know, that was a really enjoyable experience, so I wanted to interview them again. Leanne City Chamber Orchestra is literally the first ensemble in Hong Kong that commissioned me to do anything. Like when I was fresh out, you know, undergraduate, you know, I was just, you know, I didn't really know anybody, and Leanne was very open, and she's always sort of approaching young composers. So, so I wanted to look at her, maybe, you know, sort of bring people's attention to her work a little bit more as well. And the Hong Kong U Gamelan, I played in it when I was a student at Hong Kong U as well. So there's those two levels. Like there's always a personal connection, but logically, of course, they also fit in with the project because they show, I guess, they all show a different side of how the word orchestra or orchestration could be creatively misread in the most positive way possible. I'm not saying that, oh, they are doing this and they don't understand what an orchestra is, but as a, like in a very Howard Bloom sort of sense, to sort of clear creative space for oneself so you can reclaim the term and make something your own, although it might not be perceived as yours.
Thank you very much. Uzma, yes, please, yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It was it was actually beautiful, right? And I love the aesthetics of orchestrating, of orchestra, of the community, of the building of the community, and the metaphor is very strong. And maybe even slightly heavy-handed. right? But still beautiful. I'm curious about, in the sharing of sonic space, do you feel like the orchestra is in some way a gentrification of sound, especially since we started out with this idea of the city and where we place things and how that happens. And then I'm thinking about the politics of noise, right? And the regulations of noise, and noise as music, or noise within, the idea of discord, and, you can think about, the history of noise. And so if there's any link between kind of city regulation, sound, noise, and this idea of a gentrification of that.
Thank you.
I think I would echo Samson really on the whole misreading of the word, misreading of the term orchestrations and orchestra, because like when you think about the different orchestras that were used, I think for me the closest that I would understand is the gamelan orchestra, which if you look at the ethnographic root of that ensemble, it is purely ceremonial. It is purely used for, like, say, Javanese royal customs and traditions, and until very recently was never incorporated within this idea of what is an orchestra, or even within an academic institution to understand a very particular part of Asia, like Southeast Asia. If you were to go to any faculty, university faculty that has a studies major in Southeast Asian studies, I guarantee you will find a gamelan orchestra there. But in that sense of the word, like the gentrification of the noise or sound itself, it wasn't a direct. It wasn't. What?
Yeah, I guess it wasn't. Yeah, it's a very good point, but it wasn't on my mind. But now thinking back, I mean, one special thing about how I approached these different groups is that I never filmed them in concert. They were all rehearsals. So, and rehearsal is this really wonderful space where like people are just sort of trying things out, and people at the back, like in the fifth desk, they are just sort of following along or like pretending that they are playing, and these sort of noises are generated. You see a very different energy when you're in a concert. People are much more themselves when I mean, for anybody who's played in an orchestra, even a youth orchestra, there's this lesson that you always learn, or this thing that you're always reminded of, how you sit in a concert. You never sit like this, which is sort of a lot more comfortable, I guess, and casual. But like, if you're especially in the front row and you're sitting like this, it's considered to be very unprofessional and sort of. But why shouldn't people be sitting like this? I mean, it's nice. I mean, it's relaxing to be sitting like this and playing like this. But like rehearsal is where people sit like this, and where people make mistakes and things like that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Anila, yeah.
Thank you to the entire team. I learned quite a lot from a context that I certainly need to learn more about. So I really appreciated how you carefully went through at least some of the more recent history and the making of communities through orchestra. I have a question in general about harmony. So harmony is related to sort of musical harmony, and then related to social harmony. So is there a way that the creation of these orchestras can lead to the construction of harmony in the musical sense only, and sort of obfuscate some of the social inequalities or things that you laid out in the introduction? And so in the ways that the Daulatzai project was criticized in terms of playing to a liberal audience, so we didn't have to speak and about the politics of Palestine and Israel, right? So how you see a similar or not similar thing happening in terms of the creation of orchestras, but what that depoliticizes in the context that you know way better than I do. So I just want to learn about that. And then a second, it parallels or really tacks on to one of the questions in the Hamburg team about why video and not audio. Now, in sound studies, there's a lot of stuff written about sort of the hegemony of the visual and how we can sort of shift that so we can all be more attuned to using our ears. And so it tacks onto that, but also in terms of the literature on sound studies of really privileging different senses, where the over-privileging of the visual.
Right.
Thank you.
So I'll take the I'll take the second question first. There's definitely that whole discussion about the tyranny of the visual, and that's not partly, I would say almost entirely why sound art and sound studies have become such an interesting topic to various different groups in recent years. But I also, as somebody who worked with sound, I'm very against the notion of over-romanticizing sound and somehow thinking that hearing and sounding has a superior ethical position over like the visual. I think when we experience, I think maybe the lesson of sound artists and we sort of focus on sound is not there's sort of differences in ethical position, but rather that we don't experience things as separate ears and separate eyes. So it's the whole body. And so when I go to an orchestra concert, I remember, I remember fondly one of my earliest sort of experiences of an orchestra as being sort of really bewildered and fascinated by how the orchestra moves to the movement of the conductor. And that's definitely a visual theater that is accompanied by sound. But then of course you can think of it as sort of a sonic theater that has sort of visual elements. So I think, I guess when I work on projects, you see that even though I work with sound in my drawings, I try to think with the whole body. And but the other thing, the choice of the film, I hope that, I'm very open to comments after people have seen the film tonight, but I think what I try to do is actually use the film like I would edit a composition. So for me, it's very compositional and musical, and the way. Of course I sort of cut the sound so they make a composition, and that there's a structural timeline that makes certain musical sense. But I also actually compose on top of it. So I wrote sort of a second layer and bring out certain things in certain moments that otherwise you would not hear.
Just to, very useful provocation actually, thanks for that. So I hear cinema as much as singing. So I think for us it's not a question of hearing sound, but or creating a space for sound per se, because that creates the danger of a ghetto. And in fact, I am against sound art and sound studies because sound is everything partakes of sound except for painting, perhaps. But even the silent dimension of painting is of great interest to me. For instance, it's a kind of condition of existence of painting. But it's not. It's a question of vindicating the importance of sound in visual media, or in so-called visual media such as cinema or other. So I think we're slightly more interested in that. But you're quite right. I mean, that's a debate that's happening, and we should take a position, right? Yeah.
I'll answer the first question with regards to how many Sayed's East West and Divan Orchestra and things like that. We do believe that it's purely temporary, and that the question of even solving the issues would be very difficult. Like if we were to look, one of the films that we screen as part of this public programs for the presentation is Knowledge is the Beginning, which is the documentary that was done for the East West and Divan Orchestra. But it also highlighted a lot of issues that went on with the orchestras. Like it's for those who are not familiar with it, it's a project that was undertaken by Edward Sayed and Darren Barenbaum that was subsequent to their conversation in the book called Parallels and Paradoxes, where there was this idea of forming every summer an orchestra made up of teenagers from different parts of the Middle East, like Palestinians, Israelis, Egyptians, so on. And they would tour around, and it was part of the Vienna EU project. And this gave them the opportunity to tour around Europe playing Wagner, but at the same time trying to acknowledge their own differences between each other, like who is allowed to be, like, say, the first string, who is allowed to play in such a manner. Would the orchestra travel to another country where a member of the orchestra is discriminated against because of visa issue, and vice versa. So that film itself kind of played out the politics behind it, but also, like, it also, there was a kind of fetishization behind it. Like, we read the book, we looked at it as a point of reference. We also followed up with some of the critical literature that actually came out of that. Like, there's been some writings from the Royal Holloway where they claimed that this was a false utopia. And then at the same time, I think, like, this year or last year, this became sort of like this problematic model, because, like, at the same time you had people like Yo-Yo Ma that's taking another group of disenfranchised Chinese youth through China. Silk Road, basically. That's the most recent readaptation of this whole idea of, like, orchestra making as a way of breaking through the barriers. And for us was more like a methodology, not so much to solve the issues, because we saw the first two case studies that we had. One, the Blue House, where, like, people were being forced out of their houses because of property prices in Hong Kong. They had to stay over there. The Chongqing mansions, where no one acknowledges them as a community or their own society, because they drift so far outside the main Sino-centric Cantonese-driven narrative of Hong Kong. So how do we, in any sense, like, look at these two, not to polarize the argument, but even, like, deal with either one of them and say, yes, we are building something meaningful, because, like, that would have been really problematic for us to undertake that statement.
And just to cap on that, yes, orchestras can be exclusionary as much as inclusive, by the way. And I think we ended up more or less agreeing that it's a matrix, is a model rather than a solution, or something. You know, that's a bit sobering perhaps as a conclusion, but that's it.
Thank
Maybe
you.
this is
Miles,
an
yeah.
invitation to provoke something. Is it possible somehow to connect your project with the project of Teatro del Ojo? Because those two projects highly focus on listening to the other as a means of producing an own statement or an own research. Did you get that? Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Well, the question would be how these two projects can be related. For example, the Teatro del Ojo project was giving voice and ear to others in the forum. I understood this as such. And part of the project was that others were listening could explain and perform. And out of this came a series of movies. Your project is also giving in the film, in your research, ear and attention to others performing in orchestra. And do you see any relation or a confrontation between these two modes?
I was going to intervene to ask a question. Maybe I can tie it with your question that is very strange to me, and I need to react in that direction. It has to do with this. It's unfair because we need to see the movie. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. And it looks like it's going to be a very solid intervention. And it probably is going to be a very well-made artwork. So my question is not a matter of value, it's a matter of perspective. And it's got to do with this. If I feel tempted to try to separate the establishment of the space, and maybe this is the production of a space rather than the lending of the possibility of a voice, And that's a difference. But I'm very tempted to separate the establishment of the gallery space from the artwork. Thinking, but that's what's going to be my question, that maybe they are not intrinsically connected, that they need to be discussed in different ways. Because, just looking for an analogy, in 1996, Daniel Joseph Martinez established a place called Deep River in the worst possible place of Los Angeles downtown. It was really like a war zone, and his project, and he didn't get any money from anybody to do it, was to make a Chelsea-like gallery. And it really looked like the only thing that was okay in a space that was basically used by all these displaced homeless people that had been evicted from every lunatic asylum in the States and went to California. And it was like the post-Reagan kind of nightmare. And it was actually 5th Avenue, downtown Los Angeles. And his goal was to do two things. He established this space that was the opposite of that, and he was going to show art that no institution in Los Angeles was showing. So, just as a matter of comparison, in that case I can see perfectly well that the establishment of the space is the work and the logic. And none of the shows, no matter how important they were, specified that space. It was the program. But here, from what I understand, and that's why I'm asking the question, it could seem to be that the space is for the orchestra project. And somehow that is a connection that I don't feel essential. I mean, the orchestra could have been created and been operating and displayed in different places. I don't see exactly why the solo show was the way of occupying that space. I'm basically trying to understand what are the elements that connect all that in relation to one question. How is this something to be discussed in relation to the old-fashioned issue of public art? I mean, how does this look from the perspective of what are we doing instead, beyond, or after public art?
Thank you. So 2 points there, or two positions there, rather, should we say?
First off, the space was, we were supported by Connecting Space to do the project. It wasn't necessary that the space was made for the orchestra project itself. Curatorially, it was made to create something more than just a single temporality, but also like how do you intervene within that timeline itself and kind of create accessibility. I was very cognizant with regards to like the language that was being applied by like Samson and Giorgio, particularly like I don't come from a musicology background itself, and also like how if the project itself, orchestra making, the politics of notation, the main intent of the artwork was supposed to transcend, you know, the language that it was initially conceptualized as. How do you create this kind of porosity that enables people to encounter it from a more open point of view? That's one. Two, this was never, we thought about it as, to put it as to think about the traditions of public art. This was a very open discussion between Samson and I, that like, you know, there was, the main question that was like given to us was about how does art deal with the public itself, rather than anything. And we were also quite kind of open to the discussion with Samson and I as to like how the form should inhabit what he would feel comfortable and what he would like to try with. It wasn't it wasn't something dictated from a top-down kind of manner, but like more like an honest conversation. How can we do something and still be sincere to, or be true to our own practice itself? So we did something that we believe that we can stand behind, like, you know, creating this kind of methodology, but in a more open fashion for people to kind of intervene and pick up if they will, as opposed to a monument, as opposed to a big gathering. But like, it was something that we felt we could do and still manage and still stand behind it.
Thank you.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please, and then Gitanjali, thank you.
I found that, you know, when you started talking about Gaifang, right, the neighborhood, I thought it's really important word, because often I think, you know, just to explain, you know, when we talk about publics in this context, we tend to just think about the Habermasian publics or Michael Warner counterpublics, right? I think that the word Gaifang that Qinyi and Samson are using, they really suggest, I think, more of a very different kind of public, where you have intimacy, you have intimacy, you have some kind of care and love. This is very different from the kind of Habermasian public that we tend to imagine. So I think this is very interesting. But how, you know, maybe what could be, I don't know if you want to tease out more, is how the Gaifang form of public and then the orchestral form of public, they can be linked up in this project.
Thank you.
But I'll let Samson and Qinyi answer, but I think it's important that you bring it up because, you know, if you make the distinction between the public and the Gaifang is also very exclusionary in a way. It's a kind of like community that has, I mean, depending on how it is formed and on what basis, but it has quite clear borders. So in that sense, it's not the public at large inviting, and it's not the public sphere. So, yeah, I mean, if you brought in the...
I think precisely, I think this is why it could be productive in the sense that, you know, we don't, I think the Habermasian term has gone to the extreme to become sort of identityless, right? The careless. You don't assume anything about people in this room, but of course that's not the case.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think in an interesting way, this is going back to the question earlier about the homogenizing effect of these ensembles or orchestras, and that they sort of, they make individuals are very happy to contribute sort of to these groups, but they could also make individual indistinct, and they're all serving sort of a single musical force. I mean, all of these things are very true, but they're also very complicated. And actually, I think that's where the publication project of the exhibition started. And we went through sort of looking at the book really went through the history of orchestra, how it came into use. Started looking at Italy and sort of orchestra as political bodies. And I myself, anyway, came to the project with a very critical position, being very critical of the orchestra. And in line with earlier works that I do, I see it as maybe sort of an extension of, say, for example, notation as a system that's a like a system of language that has power over you. That was I think that was where we were coming from, or at least where I was coming from. But through working with these orchestras and interviewing them and sort of like observing their rehearsal, I really softened up. Sort of like what are these people doing? I mean, okay, this couple, they don't understand why they're calling the Chinese orchestra a Chinese orchestra. It's totally absurd, and they totally buy into this monster of a creation that is really the relic of the Cultural Revolution, and this desire to sort of align themselves with some imagination of sort of middle class classical music playing sort of, you know, good citizens. But it's their life, you know, like they don't do anything else. That's like every Sunday of their life. And so I think when like in the film, when I ask these questions, I also, maybe in a way that is, I don't know if they come through, I hope they do, in a very subtle way, I allow these qualities to come through as well. So at the end, you see that I'm, at the end, still quite fond of these individuals, although I'm asking them questions that they allow them to reveal a more sinister side of this world that is an orchestra. Yeah.
Thank you. One moment, Gitanjali first, please, if we could, and then we'll, yeah. Do we have a mic? Can we get a, Yamu, I've got mic, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Giorgio, you spoke a bit about the difficulties encountered by those from within music because the legacy can be overpowering. And Samson, during a brief chat in Hong Kong, hold on. Oops. Whoa. Okay, well, during a brief chat in Hong Kong, you mentioned about how you found sort of your presence in the sort of artistic realm kind of also liberating, in the sense it allowed you to engage with discourse and all the blah intellectual stuff, which is missing perhaps for you in music. And I'm wondering, these are the things you perhaps gain, but I'm also wondering about the things that you lose perhaps from being within the arts. And one would be simply reach, audience. Music has a far bigger audience, that's one. And the other would be, and this is something I often feel myself. You know, I listen to a piece of music and I get goosebumps, and I'm told that scientifically there's a term for it. It's called skin orgasm. And I don't know of too many times I have that kind of intuitive bodily experience when I look at a work of art. So I'm wondering how you, this is also something I want to think through. So I just want you and Giorgio perhaps to respond to these two things that you lose in the process.
Thank you very much. We've got Prasad and Quatamok, and we've possibly got time for one more person, if there is one, but we're going to finish at 5:30, so we've got 10 minutes. So I'm just wondering, Prasad, does your point in any way? No? So let's hold that one. So if we could come back on Gitanjali's, that'd be great.
I think if you're a pop musician or write for film, maybe you have a big audience, but contemporary composers have very small audiences, and the logistics of having a composition actually performed are nightmarish, actually. So I'm not sure, good point, but I'm not sure this really applies to the kind of composer that Samson would have become had he stuck to the right contemporary composer. Also, I think in music, you encounter what sound studies is becoming a little bit, sort of this Balkanized territory where the hearing is severed from everything else, and we're moving into the visual, in my case the dramatic or the situational, to actually reclaim listening. Listening is richer once you relocate it, you situate it in a visual, dramatic, a richly social context. So so in a sense, I'm throwing this back at you and saying, no, we don't lose. In fact, we gain. Hearing is more meaningful and is richer, it's more nuanced once it's resituated, even in a gallery space.
I think, I agree with Giorgio, and I also think that, we had that conversation about sort of what it is to be thinking about music in this context. I think it's maybe very similar to just really interpreting music. I mean, in the more sort of in the very in the traditional sense of the word, sort of interpreting music, and why with words, when you're describing music, you're one step removed, and you're describing metaphor, you're trying to catch the metaphor, you're trying to understand how the metaphor works, whereas music has, like you said, a more direct impact and effect on you. But what really I guess in this context, what sort of the criticality of the contemporary art context, what it also enable people who love music is to get away from that power, because music is really in your head, right? But it could also, I mean, it moves you, but it also could move you in a way that is manipulative, and you want to understand why, and you want to understand why you are moved in a certain way and not other, and you want to think about those, and you want to develop a language to describe those experiences, but you don't have that language, or you try to develop that language. I think those are things that are difficult to do in the concert space, because the experience is so immediate. And it's also, of course, what you gain. What you lose is time, but what you also gain is time, right? I mean, what you lose is time in the sense that in a concert hall, people are committed to that temporal experience. I buy a ticket, there's a beginning and there's an end, and I invest an hour in that experience. But you, in a sense, you also lose the time, like time away from that time. And I think that's what you gain from having a conversation outside music. And you also very quickly learn that it's impossible to talk about music in the same way that it's impossible to communicate. I mean, here we are talking, and we are I'm saying something, and I'm trying to describe things, sort of what I'm hearing in my head, or thinking in my head, but then it's very similar to when you try to describe a piece of music, and I use this metaphor, maybe I overuse it, I use it all the time, like I can tell you why I think C major sounds kind of yellowish to me, but I could never convince you that C major is yellow. But you might hear C major as a light blue, but that's okay, we can agree that we are different. But it makes me very aware of the fact that there's a peculiar experience, like in your consciousness, and there's a conscious, like you think in a certain way, and we are all weird, and that's okay. Yeah. No, I just imagine colors. It's right, yeah.
Thank you, Prasad. Yeah.
I want to just return to the point of public. I'm kind of suggesting that public is not a given idea, notion to be consumed. It's a produced idea, and you produce it as an ideology, as a ethic, as a space, as a form, and it has form. It has distinct form, and most public is exclusionary, so it's okay to kind of work with that. In your case, music orchestra produces a public, and also vice versa. My question specifically is, does it have an afterlife? Does it have an afterlife in a sense? How does it kind of, what does it span? What is its span, and how does it kind of, do you have a projection in mind, or will it have some kind of afterlife?
Yeah, we were just talking about the afterlife over lunch, actually. So there will be hopefully an afterlife. I mean, in a sense, I think I mean, my selection is pretty random, random and directed, because I'm involved and I choose people who I know to work with. But if I'm really and this is a topic that could expand, I could look at how other people have made orchestras, people in other places have made orchestras, these community orchestras. And there are all kinds of weird orchestras in the world. I mean, there's the toy orchestra, there's the radio orchestra, there's this ensemble, theater ensemble that call themselves orchestras. And what are these people thinking when they call these groups orchestras? So I think, to me, like I said, it's sort of a snapshot of what this is right now, the film and also the exhibition. But it, like many of my projects, later it would evolve, and it would. Yeah, it's kind of like a research process, and it would expand, and we are actually talking about that right now. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And Quatamok, yeah, and then Christoph. Yeah.
It's a very simple question. The other, you were alluding to the traditional fluxus and this question of the politics of the orchestra, and I was wondering, so politically, did you play around different ways of deciding, of directing, of dealing with the score in this group of people. I mean, there was a texture of political operations inside the orchestra, and also in relation to what kind of music was played.
Thank you.
I can very quickly, I guess I can answer the question by citing one of the metaphors for orchestra that we performed. And all of the metaphors that I wrote in response to the Fluxus pieces, I'll call them shared risk for orchestras. So I guess I am trying to maybe evoke an imagination of an orchestra as a community of people that come together temporarily but have a shared risk. So like, for example, I'll describe one of the pieces. Like, the bird piece is like this. So everyone is given a bird whistle, and bird whistle is this really fun thing that you can learn to play, but it's like, once you've learned how to use, how to make a sound with a bird whistle, you can't unlearn that. Because it's, I mean, you must know what I'm talking about. Like, once you know how to roll the tongue, you can't go back to the moment you don't know how to roll the tongue. Right? It's something that you sort of learn with your body. So what we do is, like, a whole group of people, we get together, and then I tell them that this is what the piece is about, and we all learn to whistle, do bird whistle with this piece of bird whistle that I give to them, and we all stand in a circle, and we all sort of begin that process, and we don't leave until everyone has already learned or has acquired a skill to bird whistle. And it's called a shared risk because you could really be in the room for a long time, because you have to sort of wait for people. So in the seat, like, you know, when we did it with the kids, and, you know, we couldn't do it for a long time, but in the film, when I enacted it with the volunteers, it got really tiring at the end. In the film, what you see is that because people really wanted to, I mean, you can think maybe they want to leave, or maybe, but they, you know, they were really, they started to really teach each other how to do it. Like, so the people who could do it, they were showing the other people, oh, how I was doing it with the tongue. And when one person who was standing in a circle who weren't able to do it eventually got it, like, people like cheered on, and like they got really excited, and then eventually one by one they left the circle, because you have to stand in a circle until you know how to whistle. So I mean, of course, there is still, and we dealt with that a little bit in the publication. There is still a facilitator, there is still a composer. All of those hierarchies are still there, but I guess by highlighting certain features, I don't know if I'm undoing those hierarchies or whether it's useful to undo those hierarchies. But you begin to think of the group that you are in a little differently, I guess, and you behave a little differently to each other, knowing that we could really be in this room for like a very long time if not each one of us had learned how to do bird whistle. And I don't know if that makes the metaphor pieces different to the Fluxus pieces. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I think in my mind, there is a difference when you do that. And so, yeah, they are all pieces like that. They're all pieces like that involve a process that could go on forever if you're not sort of helping each other and sort of thinking about the fact that you could be in the room forever. Yeah.
Thank you. Christoph.
I have three very short questions which have to do with each other, and I think you can give very short answer. The first question is, maybe I didn't really follow everything. Do these orchestras, the community orchestras you refer to, they play all kinds of music, or is it specified in specific music, let's say Western music, Eastern music, or specific Chinese music, or whatever? That's the first question. The second one is, would this be discussed publicly somehow? I mean, do the people think about that, the experts and non-experts, about this kind of education and going in this kind of music and these different kind of musics? That's the second question. The third one, are there some medias where it is discussed? Is it discussed in the TV? Are there specialized, let's say, magazines or whatever? Or they have specific forums?
Starting from the last, no, there aren't. So I think this, thank you for in a sense endorsing the project. I think what Samson's exhibition has brought forward is precisely a sense of this happening and a sense of its significance. But not only that, musicologists don't discuss that. I think there begins to be a little bit of, when musicologists or music theorists talk about orchestras, usually they create connoisseurship, very valuable, but there isn't much in the way of critical thinking about orchestras, and particularly orchestras as embodied in a wider non-musical, so-called non-musical context. Yeah, I'll let Qinyi and Samson reply.
What was number one? I would say the gamelan. They try to play many different things. They're also very open to playing new pieces. The Chinese orchestra, they play a whole bunch of, they play a range of rap, but they play a fair bit of new commission because, Chinese orchestra, they by nature have to play new commission because there's no canon. Because it's from basically, like their old pieces is like from arrangement from, of classical tunes. But actually the last concert of the Chinese orchestra that I saw was a pop concert in collaboration with a pop singer, which I thought was a very bad move, but the couple was very happy, so I'm happy for them. And then the City Chamber Orchestra of Hong Kong, they do a pretty traditional repertoire, although out of the
traditional Chinese or Western music?
Western, yeah. But although out of the different orchestras that are already in Hong Kong, they are already a little more experimental. They do like glass harmonica pieces, and they do like they did they do things like Richard Clayderman too. But yeah, they're very adventurous. Yeah.
But a very last question. If you speak about Chinese orchestra, they have also Chinese instruments? Specific ones?
Yeah, only Chinese instrument except for the lower string section where they use cello. And this is a very weird thing. Chinese orchestra tend to do that because Chinese orchestra is really not a traditional ensemble. It's an orchestra of Chinese instruments coming together and mapping themselves onto the different voices of a Western orchestra model, which is really, it mimics the Western orchestra, which came out of the Cultural Revolution and the self-strengthening.
I understand you right. And through this layering of Western and let's say Chinese music and orchestras, they create also new sound.
Yeah, it's definitely a new sound. Yeah,
okay. That's a new thing.
And it's quite a positive thing. Historically and culturally is really weird, but like I said, one really positive thing is the fact that because they have no canon, they have to commission composers all the time. So that these Chinese orchestra, be they professional or community based, they are really the most active champions of contemporary music, really, and have a very close relationship with living composers.
Great. Thank you very, very much. We do have to stop now, of course, because we are going to see Samson's film bang on 6 o'clock, just across from the university.